What happens when the world's most dangerous waterway becomes a weapon? A single drone strike exposed India's darkest secret, one attack away from running completely dry in less than 6 days.
What is the truth about the Strait of Hormuz chokehold, India's $100 billion energy nightmare? Why does an emerging economic titan live in constant fear of a tiny, distant waterway?
Somewhere between the sun-scorched deserts of Oman and the rugged coast of Iran lies a maritime corridor just 21 miles wide. It looks completely insignificant on a world map, but for the Indian subcontinent, this microscopic choke point is a terrifying ticking time bomb.
Why is India so uniquely and dangerously dependent on this specific geographic bottleneck in the Middle East? How did they become so exposed?
India single-handedly accounts for a staggering 14.7% of all global crude oil flows passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Unlike Western nations that have aggressively diversified, India's booming industrial economy runs almost exclusively on fossil fuels pumped directly from the Persian Gulf.
Doesn't China import even more Gulf oil than India, making Beijing just as vulnerable to a catastrophic maritime blockade in the strait?
Surprisingly, no. While China buys massive quantities of crude, oil makes up only 18.2% of their total national energy mix, thanks to a colossal domestic coal industry and a rapidly expanding renewable power grid. Beijing is structurally insulated from a sudden Middle Eastern shock.
What exactly happens to the Indian economy the moment a regional crisis spikes global oil prices and disrupts the supply chain? The financial bleed is instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. Every single time Brent crude surges by just $10 a barrel, up to $20 billion vanishes from the Indian economy. Headline inflation immediately surges, economic growth stalls, and the rupee faces a devastating crash.
Could a foreign power actually tax India's vital energy lifeline directly at the choke point, bleeding the nation dry without firing a shot?
Yes, and the economic math is terrifying. A proposed Iranian transit toll of just $1 per barrel on ships passing through Hormuz would instantly slap the Indian economy with an $800 million annual bill, just for the basic right to transit.
Has the shadowy Middle Eastern oil war already spilled over into India's sovereign maritime territory, threatening ships close to home?
It has. On December 23, 2023, the unthinkable happened. The MV Chem Pluto, a massive commercial tanker carrying vital chemical cargo, was struck by a weaponized drone just 200 nautical miles off the coast of Gujarat. The war had officially reached India's doorstep.
How did the Indian military respond to a direct, explosive attack occurring so dangerously close to their own sovereign shores?
With overwhelming, immediate force, the Indian Defense Minister issued a chilling public warning, vowing to hunt down the attackers, even if they were hiding on the seabed. Within days, heavily armed guided missile destroyers like the INS Kochi and INS Kolkata were deployed to the Arabian Sea.
What exactly are these heavily armed advanced destroyers day and night in the turbulent waters of the Arabian Sea?
They are executing Operation Sankalp, a massive and grueling maritime security effort. The Indian Navy has been forced to physically escort over 200 vulnerable commercial ships, ensuring that 21 million tons of vital cargo safely navigate the treacherous waters back to Indian ports.
Is there a hidden domestic crisis that a Strait of Hormuz blockade would immediately trigger, reaching far beyond transportation and industry?
Yes, and it strikes directly at the heart of every Indian home. A staggering 90% of India's liquefied petroleum gas, the essential cooking fuel relied upon by hundreds of millions of families, passes directly through the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz.
What happens to the civilian population if that daily supply of cooking gas is suddenly severed by a maritime conflict?
Absolute domestic chaos. Without that critical daily injection of imported LPG, hundreds of millions of households would instantly lose their ability to safely cook meals. The years-long transition away from traditional biomass fuels would reverse overnight, sparking widespread panic and immediate civilian unrest across the subcontinent.
How does a maritime choke point halfway across the Arabian Sea threaten the very foundation of India's vast agricultural sector? Through the import of vital fertilizers,
Over 54% of India's imported agricultural fertilizers must transit the Strait of Hormuz. If those crucial shipments stop, crop yields across India's vast farmlands would plummet, transforming an energy crisis into a devastating nationwide food shortage.
With food and fuel hanging by a thread, just how large is India's strategic safety net to survive a total blockade? Shockingly small. India's strategic petroleum reserve capacity sits at a mere 5.33 million metric tons. For a rapidly growing nation of 1.4 billion people, this infrastructure was originally designed to provide just 9.5 days of emergency crude cover. Are India's emergency underground oil reserves actually full and ready to be deployed in a worst-case global scenario?
No. Recent data reveals that India's strategic reserves were sitting at only 64% capacity. Decades of bureaucratic delays, land acquisition issues, and strict budget constraints have left the underground caverns partially empty, stripping away the nation's already razor-thin margin for error.
What is the terrifying ultimate reality of India's vulnerability in the Strait of Hormuz? How close are they to the brink?
Despite its status as an emerging economic superpower, India is secretly sitting on a terrifying countdown. Its strategic oil reserves would run dry in less than 6 days if the 21-mile-wide Strait of Hormuz were blocked. This narrow maritime choke point controls nearly 90% of India's cooking gas and over half its fertilizers, meaning a blockade wouldn't just spike gas prices, it would trigger a catastrophic domestic food and fuel collapse within a week. To dodge this $100 billion nightmare, New Delhi has deployed heavily armed warships and executed a massive, controversial pivot to Russian crude, desperately buying time as its economy hangs in the balance.
Did the massive geopolitically risky pivot to Russian crude actually solve India's underlying energy security crisis?
It acted as a temporary tourniquet, not a cure. While buying discounted Russian oil outside the traditional Middle Eastern routes saved billions of dollars and briefly stabilized the economy, the physical geography remains unchanged. The vast majority of India's energy still relies on highly vulnerable sea lanes.
How long can a rising global superpower outrun a ticking clock before the countdown finally reaches zero? Until India drastically revolutionizes its domestic energy grid with massive investments in renewables and nuclear power, it will remain a hostage to geography. For now, the world's most populous nation goes to sleep every night hoping that a 21-mile stretch of water remains open until morning.